Well, interesting week. We had one of the greatest milestones in world history. I mean, that you can't overstate the importance of the Apollo 11 moon landing. I mean, I can't think of only the coming of Jesus Christ, perhaps. I can think of very few things that would rival, in terms of human drama, the landing of a man on the moon. And predictably, the progressive left did everything they could to downplay, mock, and traduce the landing on the moon simply because it was America who did it. It was Western culture it emanated out of Western culture, and it was those annoying cisgendered white men almost exclusively who took part in it. So during the week-long celebrations we just had for the Apollo 11 50th anniversary was this disgusting tweet from the Washington Post, who makes a living out of engaging in disgusting tweets. In a tweet that has resulted in swift and furious blowback online, the Washington Post chose to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the historic Apollo 11 mission by framing the giant leap for mankind as racist and sexist. First and foremost, the argument is one leap for mankind excludes women. The word mankind, how we're changing language. It's always funny to me. When I teach in my university classrooms, this comes up all the time, this vogue, this fad for eradicating gender-based pronouns and really destroying the beauty of the language. I hear this from my students all the time. Don't use the word mankind. Use the word humankind. So let's take a look at that. If we had said, one giant leap for humankind, there's a problem. The word man still exists inside the word human. Oh no, we can't use that. Well, Dr. Pesta, no fear. There's a way to get around this. What if we said personkind? One giant leap for personkind. Oh, I'm sorry. If you take a look at the word person, you see the word son, S-O-N. And I tease my students with this as a way of mocking how ridiculous this is. But the Washington Post's argument about why the Apollo 11 moon landing is racist and sexist goes way beyond one giant leap for mankind. The argument that they make is that, well, it wasn't diverse enough. And this is all the progressive left has. No matter what it was, no matter what the argument is, no matter what historical event we're talking about, if too many white people are involved, or if it's primarily something that emanates out of white Western culture, white American history, well, then by definition, we have to demote the achievement, or we have to attribute the achievement to somebody else. That's another big tool of the left, right? If some great thing has happened, remember Elizabeth Warren, you didn't build that. You didn't build that. You don't own that. Everything that America was built on the back of slaves, and on it goes. With the argument that there is no unique American culture, that American ingenuity has accomplished nothing, that when you talk about World War II, we must talk about the fact that you had segregated divisions, segregated versions of battle. Blacks were sent in by themselves. Japanese Americans, many of whose family had been interned, were oftentimes put together in battalion groups. This kind of stuff over and over again. So we've got to downplay the major events in Western history because they're not diverse enough. It's funny. You would think that if we were playing consistent, if the progressive left was playing consistently, we would have to argue that the creation of the Great Wall of China was really no big deal. In fact, it was actually kind of racist because it was perpetrated by pretty much Chinese slave labor. There wasn't a lot of racial diversity in those people who built the Great Wall of China. Mostly men, almost exclusively men, built the Great Wall of China. They were Chinese men, and so therefore, rather than being one of the great engineering feats of world history, we're going to have to traduce it. It only applies to Western culture, these kinds of stupid, one-sided racial arguments. So as you can imagine, there weren't a lot of women working in the control booth. There weren't a lot of women on that capsule that made it to the moon, and so consequently, we have to sort of tear down the achievement a little bit. Meanwhile, and related to this, if you can't traduce the American achievement on the basis of race, if you can't do that, then you have to go another way. And the New York Times takes the cake with this. As we all again celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing, you would think there would be, if there's one event in American history that we as Americans of any race, any gender, any ethnicity, any background, whatever country we came from, if there was one example of an American achievement that we could celebrate, it would be the Apollo 11 moon landing. This was indeed a great big leap for mankind, humanity, humankind, person kind, people kind, whatever you want to call it that make the progressives happy. But we can't celebrate this. Remember the movie that came out 6 months or so ago about the Apollo 11 landing, where they didn't have the American flag on the patches on the uniforms of the astronauts, and the argument was made by the producers, well, this isn't really an American achievement. It was a global achievement. It was a human achievement. That kind of nonsense. You would, again, never do it. You would never do that in terms of any other cultures. You would never say of the great pyramids of the Inca, the Maya, and the Aztec, you would never say of them, well, they weren't just Aztec accomplishments. There were lots of other diverse native tribes that you wouldn't do it. But for American culture, you do. But the New York Times, as they usually do, takes the cake here. As we celebrated that 50th anniversary, the Times felt it necessary to lecture us readers, well, I don't read it, I'm sure you don't either, to lecture its readers, that the U.S. actually lost the space race. I'm not kidding you. The space race was actually won by the Soviets because they were a much more diverse space program than ours. They literally make the argument that the Soviets went to great lengths to put the first Asian in space, the first woman in space, the first black person in space, long before the Americans got around to it. And therefore, landing on the moon is actually not what the space program was about. It was about how quickly could you get people of color into orbit. That's according to the New York Times. And there's not a single acknowledgement on the part of the New York Times that these so-called diverse cosmonauts that the Russians were putting up there, they weren't put up there as an example of how well black people in the Soviet Union, Asian people ask the people of Kazakhstan or Georgia, who had been conquered by the Soviet military machine, just how fair and open the Russian Empire was to Asians. It was like everything else. It was like the Potemkin villages the Russians used to show Westerners. This was Potemkin diversity. And by the way, Dr. Duke is trademarking that phrase, Potemkin diversity. I have not heard anybody else use it, so put a little TM by that. Potemkin villages were these fake villages where everybody had groceries and everything looked fine and dandy, and everybody was living in this wonderful middle-class, upper-middle-class lifestyle, but it was all fake. It was constructed like a Hollywood set to dupe ignorant reporters from the New York Times like Walter Duranty into believing that Soviet communism was somehow superior to American capitalism. So this is Potemkin diversity. It's fake diversity. There's no acknowledgement on the part of the Times that these diverse cosmonauts were propaganda efforts on behalf of a totalitarian regime and in the service of a globalist expansion ideology that wanted to subject the entire world to its twisted political worldview. None of that. The first Asian person in space for the cosmonauts was Vietnamese. And they didn't put him in space because they wanted to say how much they loved Asians, or how diverse the Soviet Politburo was. Hint, it wasn't. What they were doing was protesting the Vietnam War. By taking a Vietnamese male and sending him into space, they were making a huge global statement about how much better the Soviets were, and the Soviet participation in supplying the North Vietnamese with weapons was compared to America's racist system. And the first the first black man in space was also sent out by the cosmonauts, but he was Afro-Cuban. And so they sent a black man living under a communist regime, a communist ally of the Soviets. They sent him into the air, not because they were diversifying Russian schools with black Cubans, or not because they were importing Africans into the Russian Empire to diversify it, but to stick it to the Americans, right? The same country that tried to bring missiles to Cuba, triggering the Cuban missile crisis. At the same time, they were sending a black Afro-Cuban into space as a propaganda tool to try to alienate African Americans in the United States and perhaps provoke race wars and riots in the United States. So all this was done in a calculated, utterly political way. But this is not new for the New York Times. Here are some of the other headlines they've given us. Women had better sex under communism. Of course. Stalinism inspired Americans, another New York Times article. How about this one? The Bolsheviks were really romantics deep down. When you're cutting throats and raping village girls, how romantic can it get? Lenin was an environmentalist. How about that one? Without the Soviets, we would not have Star Trek. Well, maybe it's a reason the Soviets should have gone away. And finally, how about this doozy from the historical archives of the New York Times? The Soviets supported the Harlem Harlem Renaissance. So the Soviets were great supporters of black liberation in America. There is no end to the New York Times perfidy when it comes to trashing American history and unmaking American greatness. The funny thing is that many Americans who don't live in flyover company, we know the difference. We know what America has justly achieved. And that's it. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm Dr. Duke with The New American. We'll talk to you next time.